Hello, everyone, and welcome to Head to Head. I'm Bill Etheridge, and I'm really glad tonight to have with me a guest who let's see how I can embarrass him more before we start. I've mentioned before on social media advertising this, one of the great conversationalists, without doubt, a legend of the Brexit movement, someone who's been involved throughout many years with the Freedom Association as well as politically, and a man who is, I think it's fair to say, a bon viveur and a man of many interests and tastes. So it's going to be an interesting hour, and there he goes to set us off with it. So I want to introduce everyone, first of all, to a gentleman I'm very proud to call a friend, Mr. Roger Helmer.
Hello, Bill. Great to see you. Thanks very much for inviting me on the show. And while you're talking about the great contribution that you think I made to the Brexit project, let's not forget the contribution that you made, because you're one of the soundest guys in the European, or used to be in the European Parliament, and it was a pleasure to work alongside you.
Oh, well, thank you, Roger. I do appreciate that. I did my best. I probably didn't hit the same heights of lyricism on my speeches that you did, but I'm sure we all played our part in different ways. So, without further ado, because this is one of those shows, I was saying to Roger before we started that it seems it's going to be hard to fit it all in an hour because there is so much to talk to Roger about. But I think it's important when we do these kind of shows to get a feeling more for the person, because a lot of people out there watching will know of the work of Roger Helmer, know of the views, which we'll come on to later in great effect. But I think knowing more about the man would be nice, and it's one of those things. I've had the pleasure to get to know you as a man, but I think people there would like to know more. So shall we start at the beginning, Roger? Tell us about your early life. Tell us how it all began.
Well, Bill, thanks for that introduction. That's great, and I'd love to do that. Even before I start there, could I just drop in an apology? Because I was enjoying my Christmas lunch last year, as it now is, and all of a sudden, oh dear, one of my front teeth went away completely, and I looked really weird, and so I apologize for that. And I assure you that I'm going back to the dentist on the 2nd of February, and I'm getting a crown put on. But in the meantime, I got problems. So
well, we can only see when you laugh. It's only when you smile, as the saying
only
goes.
when I laugh. I'll try to avoid laughing. Now, early life. I was born as long ago as 1944, so I was a wartime baby. And that's important in the present context, of course, because it means that I'm over 75 and therefore in line. And indeed, I've had the first injection in the vaccination series. I was born in southeast London, or alternatively Kent, in the town conurbation of Eltham, and in the Eltham Cottage Hospital, which you may be interested to know is where Bob Hope was born, but 40 years before me. And if he'd lived, I think he'd be 116 now. But that's where I started out, went to school in that area. My parents moved to Southampton when I was sort of 11-ish. My father was a university lecturer, and he started lecturing at the University of Southampton. I was in Southampton through until I went to university. I went to Cambridge. I left Cambridge and joined Procter & Gamble, which was kind of standard way of getting into marketing and into business, and I would say into international business. I tended to be a bit of a mercenary. Instead of settling down to stay with Procter & Gamble, and by the way, I soon learned that people who retire from Procter & Gamble, in those days at least, had a life expectancy of about 11 months after they retired, which never struck me as being a terribly good idea. So I moved on, did various things, but an opportunity arose in, when was it, 72, to go to Hong Kong with a company called Reader's Digest. And for those younger viewers, Reader's Digest used to be a thing in 1972, even if it ain't much of a thing now. And I went off with them to Hong Kong, but first did an orientation course. I thought it was nice, an orientation course for Hong Kong. 3 months in New England, in the United States, at their head office, which was good. I was there for a while. Back in the UK, I did several years with a couple of companies. But then I got into the, would you believe, general management area with a fantastic company in Thailand, which rejoiced in the name of Louis T. Leon Owens. You may not know the name, But if you remember The King and I, then that nice lady who in The King and I, the girl who educated the king's children, was in fact Anna Leon Owens, and Louis T. Leon Owens was her son, and very smartly exploited his royal connections to start a business sometime in the 19th century. The business was still there when I was there, and I was the general manager of that company for a number of years, working in Thailand, which was quite an experience, but I won't go into any detail there in case some of your more fragile listeners are shocked. I then, I think, had a couple of years back in the UK, and eventually joined the textile industry and went out to Malaysia. Now, Malaysia was a hell of a thing, although I'd been in Hong Kong and I knew I sort of liked Asia. I didn't really know much about Malaysia. And we were living in Malacca, which in those days was a charming little seaside town. I believe it's been overrun by hotels and all that kind of stuff. But in those days, it was great. The business was going extremely well. And also there were wonderful new things to do, like Scottish country dancing and running a thing called the Hash House Harriers, which I won't go into because if I start on the Hash House Harriers, frankly, it'll take you half the program to talk about it. But basically, it's a running club that drinks lots of beer, or a beer drinking club that does lots of running, either way.
I think the beer drinking part would have been the part I'd have been more involved in.
Well, indeed. But the running was good. I got to a stage in my early life, well, that stage in my life, I was actually running marathons, and I've run, how many is it? Completed 4 marathons in my time. But there we are. I moved on from there to Korea. I worked in Korea for a number of years, but while actually in Korea, I managed to switch companies. It was a big switch in terms of products, but it was still marketing and general management, moving on from the textile business actually to the Scotch whisky business. And I was working with what was then Guinness PLC and is now called Diageo, which gave me a kind of lifetime interest in Scotch whisky, which has stayed with me, I'm happy to say, until today. Came back to the UK, and I was working then again in the textile industry using the experience I got there. But that was a stage when I was getting more and more interested in politics, and particularly the politics of Europe. And I've got a confession to make, and this may come as a horrible shock, but the first speech, I was going to say public speech, it wasn't really public, but in front of a decent audience that I can ever remember making was when I was at school, in the School Debating Society, and the debate was, this house would join the common market, from which you can see that it was before 1973. And I led the debate, this house would join the common market, and we won the debate. And the reason, my reasons were very simple, summarized in 2 words: trade and jobs. I believed it was like a free trade area. It would result in economic development, and it would be great for trade and jobs. And that seemed to me a good thing, and I argued vigorously in favor of it. Gradually, over a long career, I've started to realize what it's all about. And there's a great deal more to it than trade and jobs.
Well, I think we can forgive you for that early support of it, because I think the great lady, Mrs. Thatcher herself, was at one point very much in favour. So I think you may have travelled a similar path on that. So we'll forgive you.
Anything I can do to emulate the great lady will be good with me. But it was absolutely fascinating how it went after that. Britain was getting ready to join the euro. You remember those days, and everybody was saying, "Oh, we're going to get ready to join the euro." I had deep reservations. Well, I thought it was just wrong, and I still think it would have been wrong. I think now everybody agrees with me, but in those days, a lot of people thought it would be right. And I remember I was listening to John Humphreys on the Today programme, and I was driving. Now, this time I was managing director of the textile business that dealt directly with Europe. Well, we were a subsidiary of a European company. But I was driving to a conference organized by the good and the great, and I think chaired by the bishop or somebody like that, and supported by the trade unions and the civil servants and some business people. I went to this conference, and they started talking in very sort of positive terms about how we all had to be ready to join the European currency and what a huge advantage it was going to be. and so on and so on. And there was no dissenting voice until they had questions shortly before coffee time. And I got up and asked a question. And basically I said, well, hang on a minute. We've been talking as though this is the best thing since sliced bread, but we haven't decided to do it yet. We haven't had our referendum yet. And there is a strong group of economists who think it would be a disaster. So don't you think we ought to take that a bit more seriously and think carefully before we do this? And I was impressed that, I wouldn't say there was wild applause, there wasn't, but there was a little sort of titter of appreciation around the room. And I thought, well, I'm not entirely alone on this. And strangely enough, we then got into coffee break, and there was a sort of biscuit buffet. And around the biscuit buffet, I bumped into a wonderful guy, and I ought to be able to tell you his name, but it's gone from me for the moment. It was a long time ago, who turned out to be the chairman of the European Committee of the Conservative Party in one of the counties, because we were organised in those days on a county basis. And we started having a chat, and I said I was very concerned about this, and I knew a lot of people out there didn't like it, and I'd love to do something about it. And I said rather tentatively, what about the European elections? They're coming up sooner or later. And he said, good Lord, you're just the sort of chap. He said, and you've hit it at the right time, because we're starting to select. This was ahead of the 99 Euro elections, and the selection, not election, the selection was going to be in 1998, and we were about 6 months ahead of the selection. So I then, although I was running a textile business in Leicester, I have to admit that I started giving more and more of my attention to the whole question of getting elected to the European Parliament. And I worked out a strategy, which I will commend to you because it was successful in the end, or rather I'll commend to anybody out there who might like to try this. What you do is you really get stuck in to your local constituency association. In fact, the advice is not very helpful because we're no longer in the EU, we're not electing MEPs, so it wouldn't work on the same basis. But the first selection stage in those days was what's called a paper selection. In other words, you've got a committee sitting around piles and piles and piles of applications and CVs and trying to sort out who is worth talking to in the first instance. And I knew that all I needed in that meeting, I needed one person who was on side, who would get my piece of paper and pull it out and say, hey, you want to meet this guy? We've seen a lot of him in the constituency and he's doing okay. So I gave enormous attention to the constituency of what was then Blaby, which is now South Leicestershire. And sure enough, the constituency chairman at the time, who was on the first paper selection committee, pulled out my CV and said, we've got to see this guy. So I was invited to the first round of interviews. That went well. Eventually got to the second round of interviews. I could talk about that for a long time. It was hilarious. And it came down at the end. I was going around the counting room in the evening because it was a very complicated count. It wasn't just yes or no. It was ranking and points depending where you were ranked and all like that, and people doing bar charts at separate tables. And there were two people who were clearly ahead of the pack. And one of them was me, and one of them was a guy called Bill Newton-Dunn, who was elected at the time and quit the Conservative Party after about a year in the Parliament and went and joined the Lib Dems, but that's another story. I don't know why. I had a long day and it had been hard work and I was tired, and I was excluded, of course, from the subsequent candidate presentations because you can't listen to other candidate presentations at a selection, otherwise you have an unfair advantage. So in a sense, I've been there and not been there for a large part of the time. But looking around the way the points were coming up, I could see I was doing well, I could see he was doing well, and I became consumed with an irrational desire to come first. And it was crazy, really. It didn't make any difference because we knew we'd get 2 elected in the region. So if I was number 1 and number 2, I'd still get elected. In fact, in the end, we got 3. And Chris Heaton-Harris, who's now the Conservative MP for Daventry, came in at number 3. He hadn't expected to be elected, but we did much better than we'd thought. But there was Bill, who had been an MEP before on a single county basis. He'd been MEP for Lincolnshire. And he was the only person who served in the European Parliament before. So naturally, he thought he was the number 1 man. and everybody else was, who are these unknown people? These also-rans are also applying, and blow me down. We were there neck and neck, but when it came to the point, I was sort of edging ahead of him, and I think, to be honest, he held it against me for the rest of his parliamentary career. And certainly he wasn't my favourite guy, but that's another story. Anyway, that got me in. I was elected in 1999, and at that time, I still believe the sort of conservative mantra that, there was a hell of a lot wrong with the European project, with the European Union. We didn't like the way it was going, but for heaven's sake, we had great politicians, they like to think, and we had great civil servants, and we could get in there and we could fight our corner, and we could win the arguments, and we could redirect the thing the way we wanted it to go. So in my first 2 years, I would say, in the European Parliament, if people said to me, well, what about leaving the European Union? I would reply, well, I'm not sure we ought to leave, but I think we ought to do an awful lot to revise it. And it was only as I worked in the Parliament that I started to realize it wasn't going to be like that. And the metaphor I used to use was, it's kind of like getting on a bus, isn't it? You get on a bus at the Victoria Coach Station in London, and the bus is going to Birmingham, let's say. And you decide by the time you get to the North Circular Road that you don't want to go to Birmingham, and that actually Newcastle on Tyne would be a much better place. And you walk up and down the bus saying to the other passengers and the driver, let's forget about Birmingham, let's go to Newcastle upon Tyne. And you know what they say? They say, look, we don't care about you going to Newcastle on Tyne. We got on this bus to go to Birmingham. The bus is driving to Birmingham. If you don't like it, you've got two choices. You can get off or you can come to Birmingham. Yeah. And the European project was exactly like that. The people who drove it, I'm not saying the citizens of member states, not at all, and less as time goes by, but the people driving it passionately believe in this United States of Europe. And that's where they're going to go. And no amount of persuasion and argument and demonstration or anything is going to change their minds. So I realized after a couple of years in the Parliament, you've got a choice. You can either go where they're going to a totally single state, a bit like America, if you like, only probably even worse in terms of unification. I mean, there are things the Americans can decide on a state-by-state basis that in Europe are decided in Brussels. So
yeah, I think that's one of the things with it. Actually, they're trying to emulate a federal state, but first of all, with nations that have millennia of history of not being together, and also trying to emulate a model that doesn't really work all that well in the States at times, as we can see at the moment. And actually, the power that they try to exert is much more than the federal government in Washington. Much more. It's a altogether more pervasive thing, and the destination they're heading to is even worse than a coach to Birmingham.
Yeah. One of the differences is that actually in America there is much more freedom for states to make all sorts of policy changes that in Europe member states are not allowed to do. And there's a fundamental reason why that is a good thing. And that is, if they try something in Idaho and it works, great, and everybody else can try and do it. If they try something in Idaho and the bottom drops out of it and it's a disaster, everybody else, the other 49 states, will look at it and say, well, didn't work in Idaho, we're not going to do it here. Whereas in Europe, we impose decisions made centrally and made, as you know, Bill, in the European Parliament by people who are much more interested in driving through European legislation and building the European structure than they are in the actual outcome of their legislation. So we don't have this possibility of comparing outcomes in different states. And seeing what happens. And that's what convinced me that in the end, that there was no point actually in going on the European bus to the European destination. But for a long time, I was persuaded that the Conservative Party had its heart in the right place, but it was in opposition at the time. And people used to say to me, well, the Conservative Party is not doing much to get us out of Europe, is it? And I would say, well, you just wait till we got a Conservative Prime Minister. Then we'll get it sorted out. And then eventually we got a Conservative Prime Minister, and did we hell get it sorted out? what with Cameron and May, I gave up in despair. But I mean, it was under Cameron that I decided to move across from the Conservative Party to UKIP. And it was, there was a whole series of things that went wrong. But I remember William Hague saying very early in my political career that we'd done a new deal with the EPP, and that is the political group in the European Parliament. And while for administrative purposes we'd be part of them, actually we'd be independent in terms of our policy and our criticism of the European structures and so on. And of course, the moment I got back to the group of Conservative MEPs in Brussels, they would say, "Oh, we got over that problem, didn't we? Now it's back to business as usual." And I remember jumping up in a meeting, one of the first delegation meetings I attended, and saying, "No, it's not back to business as usual. We've been promised we're going to be different. We're going to be separate. We're going to have different views on the European construction," and getting shouted down. I stuck with that, thinking that sooner or later the Conservative Party would sort it out. And actually, in a way, the Conservative Party has sorted it out, because you've got to say that Boris, with all his faults, and they are many, actually drove through the process of getting us out. I don't think his withdrawal agreement is by any means ideal. I've got some serious concerns about it. But we are out. We are no longer members of the European Union. So we got it right in the end. But I felt in, 2012, that we were going, in the Conservative Party, we were going nowhere in getting out of the European project. And that the only thing left was actually, for me personally, to do what I wanted to do. I couldn't stay in the Conservative Party, and I was sorry to leave, because I had many friends there, and it was nice to be there. No, I moved to UKIP, and then, of course, in the next European election, UKIP did remarkably well. So I managed to keep getting re-elected, whatever I did.
Well, I'm sure a lot of that was down to your good efforts, not just the lucky happen chance of you keep doing well, Roger. But I think the journey you've spoken about there, about the Conservative Party, I can relate to that to a degree, because I was a member of the Tories, not for so long as yourself. I was there from 2009 to the start of 2011. But I was constantly drip-fed this story that David Cameron, when he gets in, he's a real Eurosceptic. He's going to really sort them out. He's going to make Mrs. Thatcher's handbag look like nothing compared to what he's going to do. And we were being fed that. Every time I went out leafleting, we'd have some apparatchik from the Conservative Party organisation say, "Oh yeah, don't worry, he's a real hard liner on this." And it was a pack of lies. As quite apparent. And I think, UKIP forced the Conservatives into a referendum, and I think actually the ongoing efforts of, shall I say, the UKIP family, with our former leader Nigel, who we both know very well, going on to Brexit Party. I think the ongoing efforts of Nigel, particularly, and many others, forced the Conservatives under Boris Johnson to go down the route they've gone in. I'm perhaps not so enthusiastic a believer in Boris Johnson as some, and I think perhaps if it hadn't been for Nigel and co, I very much doubt that Boris would have delivered Brexit. I think he did it because he's trying to protect power for the Conservatives, which I think is the main motivating factor for the Conservative Party most of the time.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Bill. And they now try to say, well, of course, Boris was a leading figure in the Leave campaign, and Boris carried it through, and Boris delivered it when Theresa May couldn't. The fact is, we would not have had a referendum at all if it hadn't been for UKIP, and UKIP really cutting into the Conservative share, especially in European elections. So it is UKIP that gave us the referendum. We would not have won the European referendum without UKIP. And again, people make nice noises about Boris, and he did a pretty good job during the referendum campaign. And dare I say, the man we do not name, Dominic Cummings, he did an okay job during the referendum campaign too. But without Nigel Farage, without UKIP, it would simply not have happened. So when people dismiss UKIP as sort of mavericks and fringe people, we wouldn't be where we are if it hadn't been for UKIP.
Well, we were tantalisingly close, actually, to taking Westminster seats. I remember campaigning for yourself and on the by-election that you stood in, and I stood in 2 general elections, the 2015 one, right up until coming into the final straight. We were neck and neck with Labour, but then for various reasons the vote fell away. Largely down to good Conservative scare tactics, actually, but it worked very well. But if we'd have carried on in that vein, the Tories really we were holding their feet to the fire, as the saying goes, because they were terrified of the amount of votes we were bringing in. For a small party to be polling the way we did. I said in mine in 2015, I think it was 25% I got in Dudley North. Unheard of, and they had to take this route they've taken now. I think everyone, and particularly the activists in UKIP, it's not said often enough that they need really to be the celebrated as the heroes of independence and freedom, because it's those guys getting out there and working day and night that actually got us where we are.
Yeah, you're right, and I know you worked your socks off, and so did I, and we just believed in what we were doing. That was the thing. I remember with David Cameron, I actually voted for David Cameron as leader of the party during the election. There was a choice between him and David Davis. The reason I voted for David Cameron was he promised to take the Conservative MEPs out of the EPP, which is a highly federalist political group. And David Davis, and I don't know why, I think it was foolish of him, said he wouldn't do or wouldn't commit to doing that. He didn't say he wouldn't do it. He said he wouldn't commit to doing it. So I voted for David Cameron on the basis that he was going to take us out of the EPP. Well, we had an agreement with the EPP, which ran through the whole of that parliament, 5-year parliament. There were still 3 years to run. And Cameron said, right, I'm going to fulfill my promise. I'm going to take the MEPs out of the EPP. But of course, we have an agreement that runs for another 3 years. We'll do it at the end of that. And I felt very, very let down by that. I thought that was absolutely outrageous. I effectively gave notice to the Conservative Party that I was thinking of leaving. And I didn't say I will leave unless you do so and so. But I said I will consider my obligations to the party to have been fulfilled, which is political speak for I will quit. And it was, what's her name? Baroness Varsi, who was co-chairman of the party at the time. I think she's gone to the House of Lords and disappeared without trace. But anyway, it was she. And I wrote to her several times on this issue. I was prepared, actually, I was seriously thinking about retirement in 2012. And the guy who would have come in next on the Conservative list was a guy called Rupert Matthews, who is now...
Very good guy.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. I felt I'd be happy to retire and hand my seat over to him, as it were. I asked, there'd been rumours that she didn't like him. He was white, he was middle-aged, he was male. He was a
conservative.
He was not disabled. He was a Eurosceptic. For all those reasons, she didn't like him. He also wrote or published a book of ghost stories, and this was regarded as being a bit unrealistic. So if she'd written to me and said, yes, I confirm that if and when you resign, he will be the next in line with our normal policy, and he will take over your seat, I would have gone. In a way, from my personal point of view, I'm glad I didn't, but I was very sad for Rupert because I know he was very fired up about it. She wouldn't reply. She wouldn't make that commitment. She wouldn't reply to me. She wouldn't talk to me. And there's a lovely story because I picked up from some friends and colleagues in the Westminster Parliament afterwards. I first turned up at the spring conference of UKIP in Skegness, it was. And it was published, I think it was in the Express the next morning, the story, which we'd given them as an exclusive. But of course, what I didn't realize in the early days of social media, I walked into the spring conference dinner at 8 o'clock in the evening. And by 5 minutes past 8, I would say everybody in that room had tweeted that Helmer's come across. And apparently Varsi was immediately on the phone to Martin Callanan, who was the leader of the Tories at the time, saying, oh my God, this is going to be awful. What can we do? Can we persuade him? If we give him what he wants, will he stay? And what Martin Callanan said to Saeed Abbasi was, if you'd asked me that question last week, the answer would have been yes. But it's too late now. It's all over the press. He's not going to change his mind. You've blown it. And there was a meeting of the 22 committee shortly afterwards where I was told that Varsi got a bit of a hard time from Conservative MPs who said, look, you've gone and lost a Conservative MEP that you didn't need to lose. If you'd handle it better, he would still be on side. So that was the drama of my actually leaving the thing. But as you say, I'm absolutely convinced if it hadn't been for UKIP, we wouldn't have got the referendum. If it hadn't have been for UKIP, we wouldn't have won the referendum. So I think those of us who were in UKIP and work with UKIP can take pride in what we achieved together. Those were great days.
Yeah, and the appalling mismanagement of the Conservatives was very much our gain with you coming across, because it led to some wonderful times, and the fact that you took on, and this leads on to one of the things I want us to talk about as well. When you joined our group out there, and you became our energy spokesman, and I can vividly recall. I mean, for those who haven't witnessed the proceedings of the European Parliament, the Green agenda is the holiest of holies. It is absolute sacrilege and heresy to even question the fact that the planet's about to burst into flames and icebergs are going to float down the Thames. It's absolutely awful thing to say. And for Roger to take on our energy brief and wrote the policies at which we all united behind, and was kind enough to travel around the country talking about it as well. But some of those speeches, some of those moments in that European Parliament where you were hitting them with the reality of their pipe dreams and a different set of ideas on climate. It was beautiful. They're some of my happiest memories, actually, Roger. I sat there quietly chuckling to myself as you were doing it. But for those who perhaps haven't seen you in action on this, you dissect the green fallacy very, very nicely. I mean, could you give us just a taste of some of the issues you've got with the prevailing orthodoxy on the green issues?
Yeah, and I appreciate people are very set in their ways. They're very convinced of this and that, and it's difficult to change people's minds. But just consider a few points. First of all, we've seen the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. First of all, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere is incredibly low. You know, if you say to people, CO2 is a problem, isn't it? How much CO2 do you think there's in the atmosphere? You know, people will say, well, I don't know. Is it 10%, 20%? The answer is it's 0.04%. It's 400 parts per million. It's a trace gas. There's almost none of it. The other thing that nobody realizes, because everybody thinks of climate in terms of the last 100, 150 years, industrial revolution, you know, it used to be 280 parts per million. Now it's 400 parts per million, disaster. Ask people when they realize it's only 400 parts per million, and what do you think it was throughout history? And they would say, oh, well, it was very low in pre-industrial times, and suddenly it's got high because we've been emitting masses of it. Well, if you go back through the history of climate, the long-term Earth history, we are now living in a world where the atmosphere is impoverished in CO2. If it gets much below where it was previously, in the so-called pre-industrial age, actually plants won't grow because CO2 is plant food. And plants evolved when CO2 was 5 to 10 times as high in the atmosphere as it is today. The level of CO2 has been very much higher, and the Earth didn't burn up, and there was no runaway greenhouse effect. It is true that in those times when the world was warmer, then the ice caps melted. It's probable that there were periods of Earth history when there were no ice caps, and obviously the sea level will be higher. But people now talk about sea level rising. If you look at the last, let's say, 12,000 years, which is only a blink in the eye of geological history, but it's it's an important period. I'll tell you why it's an important period, because it is what we call an interglacial period. In other words, it's a temporary warm period between glaciations. And at the end of the current warm period, we could be looking at a mile of ice over Helsinki and Chicago and Edinburgh. It's that sort of expectation, not based on wild speculation, but simply based on what has happened over the last 2 or 3 million years. That is what there's been. People don't realize that. And then if you look at the beginning of this period, you have masses and masses of ice, and it melted very quickly in geological terms over a few hundred years. And while that melting process was taking place, sea level rose very rapidly indeed. And that was the time when the English Channel was created. Previously, we had a land link between Britain and France. Perhaps we can be grateful for the fact that that land link has gone away. We had large parts of what is now the North Sea were actually land. And that's not disputed. Archaeologists working underwater have discovered Neolithic settlements in the seabed of the North Sea, which was previously land. So you had massive sea level rise happening very quickly. And what has happened in the last 10,000 years is that the rate of sea level rise has slowed and slowed and slowed and slowed until now it is at a snail's pace. There is virtually no sea level rise. And the other thing is we get very excited about Pacific Islands, but we know that sea level has risen 500 feet since about 12,000 years ago. Now, isn't it mysterious that all over the Pacific there are lots of islands that are only about 5 or 6 feet above sea level? Either you have to imagine that for some inexplicable reason there were loads and loads of islands that were all exactly 506 feet above sea level, and now the sea level's risen 500 feet and they're all 6 feet above sea level. Or else you have to realize what Darwin realized in the 19th century, that coral atolls grow with sea level. If the sea level does rise a few inches, the atolls rise a few inches. So all this stuff about the Maldives disappearing underwater is so much nonsense. Now, sorry, I can talk about this for hours, as you know, but stop me when you're ready.
I was just going to I was just going to interject with one thing to add to your narrative, and then because I like this and I want more of this. But one thing to interject: there's a place where I used to be the councillor called Sedgley in Dudley. There is a place there called Sedgley Beacon, very large hill, and the story we tell is that it's the highest point between there and the Urals. It's that high, really. And there's even a tower on there which was there to be lit in case of invasion by Napoleon. It's part of the tower. There's the beacons across the country, really high. Anyway, one of the things that my dad, who still remembers your visit to us very fondly, used to do with me when I was a kid, was he used to take me onto that top of Sedgley Beacon, and down the side there's a slip of land where it's fallen away, and on there you find fossils of sea creatures. So the very concept that you're talking about the differing sea level, this incredibly high point of land, which is in the centre of the country and probably the highest place that you can think of, once upon a time was teeming with oceanic life. And I've got a large collection of fossils that we kept in our back garden from going up there and collecting them. And they were all trilobites and various fish. So just to add to your point, really, please carry on, because I love this. I want people to hear more of this.
You're absolutely right, Bill. I mean, what you're talking about is actually much longer timescales. The trilobites, I think, if my memory serves me right, go back about 400 million years. Seriously, a long time ago. And of course, there are two things there. There's one, that the sea level changes, and there's two, actually, that over very long periods with tectonic plate movement, the land moves as well. So you've got both factors working there. But the other thing I'd particularly like to draw attention to is if you take this last period of 12,000 years, whole of human civilization has taken place within the current interglacial period, which is a repeat of something that's happened again and again throughout history, but is likely to end at some point relatively soon. And in that period, we have seen a fluctuating temperature. So many things in climate and in astronomy and in all sorts of areas are cyclical. They go up and they go down. Even the moon has phases. Now, if you look at the history of climate in the interglacial period in the last 12,000 years, you have a series of fluctuations. The level of the high point of those fluctuations has been tending to decline gradually over the period. But basically, you're looking at a period of about 1,000 years. If you go back from today, where we're clearly having a relatively warm period, you go back 1,000 years, you get to the medieval warm period. That was when the Vikings discovered Greenland. And why did they call it Greenland? I'll tell you why. It was green. And they had an agricultural settlement, colony, if you like, in Greenland for several hundred years. This is not a matter of dispute. Archaeologists will confirm it. Eventually, that colony failed and wasn't there anymore. The reason it failed, of course, was because we moved into the Little Ice Age, post-medieval warm period. These were the days when the Thames froze over and people had ice fairs on the Thames. And of course, Greenland froze over and they could no longer maintain an agricultural community there. But this is what happened a mere 1,000 years ago. Go back 2,000 years, you get your Roman warm period. And the Roman Empire was built during a very warm period because human societies tend to do rather well in warm periods. Go back another 1,000 years and you get what archaeologists call the Minoan or Cretan optimum, when you had a great civilization there in warm temperatures. And there were previous, on approximately 1,000-year timescale, warm and cool periods. So the idea that the Earth getting a bit warmer is evidence of human activity, well, it might be, but isn't it much more likely to be, if we've had cyclical changes over many thousands of years, it's reasonable to ask, well, maybe the current warming, and admittedly there is a current warming, it's very slight, but there is a current warming, maybe that is part of this cyclical change. Maybe this is the 21st century optimum following the Roman optimum 2,000 years ago, and the medieval warm period 1,000 years ago. So that is the sort of background. And all these people who believe that we have a unique disaster going on, they need to ask themselves why a similar disaster happened again and again throughout history, and why it never led to the so-called tipping point. It never led to runaway global warming. It never turned the Earth into Venus with temperatures of 500 degrees centigrade. You know, it ain't going to happen. And if you look a few hundred years ahead, I think we should probably be more worried about future global cooling than global warming.
And the viewers' course notes are available from Roger directly to catch up on any of that. But no, the interesting point really, Roger, is that why do you think then? Because, you know, I've heard you go through this before, I heard you explain this before, and it sounds perfectly logical, perfectly real to me. How can it be then that the whole world is gripped with this mania, it seems, you know, led by poor Greta Thunberg and various other people, perhaps who are less troubled than her, but you know, various people leading the way, and it's almost an orthodoxy where we're taxed more. Green solutions are subsidised to the hilt. People believe that they're taught this in schools and, as you well know, in colleges and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, why do you think that this is happening? Do you think it's just shoddy science being accepted, or is there a political reason, you know, so they can tax and control us more? What do you think the motivation is?
Well, I know there are conspiracy theorists who think this is the new world order. I'm not entirely convinced about that myself, but I think there is a series of reasons. Firstly, people love a simplistic explanation they can get their mind round. CO2 makes the world warmer. The world warmer means we're in terrible trouble. We should worry. It's simple. Everybody can understand that. It doesn't make it true because everybody can understand it. Now, the other thing is the nature of politics. If something arises as a problem and politicians start getting letters from concerned constituents saying, I'm very worried about so-and-so, why don't you take the following action? What they ought to do is stand back, study the question, consider what the pros and cons are, and respond in a measured way. It's so tempting, and I know this, and you know this, because we've both been politicians. It's so much easier to write back and say, yeah, I agree with you, and it's a terrible problem, and rely on me, I'm going to do something about it. the other reason, of course, is very simple. And this brings us to something that's going on at the moment. All these countries that claim, poorer countries, what we used to call third world, I'm not sure whether they're allowed to say that anymore. You take the Maldives. I mentioned the Maldives already. I believe they're the people who had a cabinet meeting underwater with aqualungs a couple of years back as a sort of publicity stunt to convince people about sea level change and the problems that they were facing. But all these countries are basically saying, look, the West has profited from fossil fuels. They've had their industrial revolution over the last 100, 150 years, and they've become rich. They are now coming to us to say, we can't become rich because we can't have fossil fuels anymore. So the West has an obligation to pay very, very large sums of money to the third world to make up for it. And even a great nation like China, and we could talk about China for a long time, but China, which is now a rapidly growing economy, and by some measures is even the largest economy in the world, China is actually saying, well, hang on, we've still got some catching up to do with the West. So yes, you get on and cut your emissions, and we will sort of cut ours. And indeed, they say they have a grand plan to cut emissions, but the hell they have. They are building coal-fired power stations like they were going out of style, as is India and as are a number of other places. So they are giving themselves a huge economic advantage. And this brings me to an issue you haven't raised, Bill, which is, thank God, the US presidential inauguration.
I was leading up to it, Roger, but you beat me to the punch.
Yeah, Trump saw this, and Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, because the Paris Climate Accord is simply a con which is designed primarily to transfer very large sums of money from the West, which means you and me as taxpayers, to these other countries. For heaven's sake, we're giving foreign aid to China as we speak. China has a far bigger economy than us, and in many respects is far more advanced in all sorts of industrial and scientific areas, and we're giving them money. What is going on here? And America, Trump saw this, America is going to be required to provide huge sums of money for the rest of the world, producing climate solutions. In fact, a lot of our foreign aid now goes on these so-called climate solutions. And I was really turned off by the news today. Every morning, let me add a personal note. My lovely fiancée and I wake up in the morning and we tend to spend half an hour going through our phones and checking incoming mail and the newspaper headlines and current tweets and so on. And this morning, it was all terrible sycophantic stuff about Joe Biden and what a wonderful chap he was and what a disaster Trump had been and how glad we were that we were over those 4 years. For once in my life, I got thoroughly discouraged by the whole thing. But Biden's decision to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. Well, I don't know if you saw Ted Cruz's email about that. Yep.
Yeah.
But he said,
I thought it was very good, actually, the way he put it.
Yeah, this decision by Biden shows that he is more interested in the people of Paris for the Paris Climate Accord than he is in the people of Pittsburgh. And I thought that summed it up very well. And I see that it's gone to tens of thousands of impressions. So I think that was a very good tweet. But
many of them not very happy with him.
Absolutely. But now, there are two things I wanted to get off my chest on this, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. One is the terrible decision that Biden has made to rejoin the Paris Accord. But the other one, and this is slightly better news, and it was news that broke today, and I stress it's reported. I can't sort of confirm it with my own knowledge, but it's reported that the Information Commissioner in Britain has instructed the government to reveal the work that it's done on a cost-benefit analysis of the so-called net zero. And for those who aren't following these things, the government has decided that we've got to scrap fossil, or we're going to have net zero emissions of CO2 by 2050. That is fabulously expensive. And we know that Philip Hammond, a previous Conservative Chancellor, and I have few good things to say about Philip Hammond, but I agree with him on this one. He wrote to the then Prime Minister and the then Chancellor. No, he was the then Chancellor. Sorry, he was the Chancellor. He wrote to the Prime Minister. And he said the cost of net zero will be £1 trillion, not a billion, not a million, £1 trillion. That is 1,000 million. I mean, it is a ridiculous sum of money. And he said, this means we will have less money to spend on the NHS and education and the police and all those other good things we want to do. It will be seriously economically damaging. And if the government is going to make one of the biggest spending decisions in history, I mean, it's almost on a scale with COVID relief. It's on a scale with the previous economic crisis, the banking crisis, the money that was spent. It's on a scale even with a war. It's that sort of money. And the idea they will do that simply on a whim and a burst of enthusiasm without actually going back and checking how much will it cost and what are the benefits. Now, of course, the benefits are very difficult to define, because if you believe in climate change, you know, it's the difference between spending a load of money or losing the planet, then you probably want to spend a load of money. If, on the other hand, you don't really think that's the choice, and you don't really think that the Earth is going to burn up in 10 years or whenever Prince Charles says it's going to burn up, then it becomes less valuable. But what we can assess with some degree of accuracy is the cost of doing it. And the cost of doing it is estimated, apparently, by a previous Chancellor at £1 trillion. And really, people don't understand that. And they're trying to take away our petrol and diesel cars by 2030, which is, you may think, well, 2030, they've got 10 years, plenty of time. But the development cycle for new cars in the car industry is actually quite long. You know, if you're a company like Jaguar Land Rover, for example, recently, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they recently put up a new diesel engine facility. They've invested in diesel engines that a reasonable economist or accountant would have said, right, well, there's a factory that will keep producing diesel engines for 30 years. Suddenly, it isn't going to be producing diesel engines for 30 years. It's going to be producing diesel engines for 10 years, if you're lucky, and probably not that. You know, the damage that's being done, and they're making these decisions because, oh, it's climate change, and we all know we've got to fight climate change, and we don't care how much it costs.
Decisions taken by people who don't understand the manufacturing process and really are just going on knee-jerk reactions because it sounds good to do. And of course, if you add this £1 trillion onto the ballpark £1 trillion that we've added to our debts through lockdowns and COVID measures, it comes to the point where it's almost impossible to believe that we will ever be able to not pay back the debt, but actually service the interest, regardless of how low the interest rates are at the moment. Because they always say this term, historically low interest rates. Well, that suggests that they won't always be that way, because this is a low point. So there's a great danger there. But Roger, we're into the last 5 minutes now,
Where did the time go? You're right.
Well, time flies when you're having fun. But I wanted to get a few more things in, and I will say to anyone watching this, Roger's very active on social media, on Twitter and so on. So if any questions come from this, I'm pretty sure that he'll be around to talk to you on Twitter. But a couple of other things I wanted to run into. You spoke about before, and if we can keep this relatively short, because I've got another couple of quick questions. You spoke before about the misconceptions around Brexit that we discussed beforehand, and you wanted to talk a little bit about Mr. Carswell's latest destination, I believe.
Absolutely. I'm still amazed on social media by the lack of understanding that Remainers show in what Brexit is about. If you talk to Remainers, you will find that they think Brexiteers are uneducated. Well, I've only got a Cambridge degree in mathematics, so you can judge for yourself. They say they know nothing about international trade. I spent 30 years in international trade, and I think I know a little bit about it, working in Britain, but also overseas. They say we hate foreigners. Well, I've worked with foreigners throughout my career, and some of my best colleagues and best staffers have been non-British people, and indeed people of different races as well, which brings me to, they say we're racist, and I've worked with people of many different races, and by the way, my fiance is ethnic minority Indian, so that just shows how racist I am. When I was working in Malaysia, I had racist problems in the business, not me and them, but the Malays versus the Chinese, and I seem to spend half my time trying to balance out some of those problems. So there is a wonderful level of misconception, and I mentioned Douglas Carswell, who's got a job in America, and the Remainers are coming on Twitter and saying, well, Douglas Carswell's supposed to be a Brexiteer. What's he doing going to America? The whole point of Brexit is that we are getting out from being a province, offshore province of the European Union. We're getting out from being part of somebody else's structure, and we're facing outwards towards the world and looking for opportunities that are there. So the idea that we shouldn't go anywhere, and we're supposed, by the way, to hate foreign places. And I must say, I've visited, I think, virtually all the countries in Europe and many countries around the world in the last 10 years. So it's just a complete misconception. Brexit is about looking outward and being engaged. It's not about being parochial and self-referential in the European Union.
What point well made, sir. Now, we're into the last 3 or 4 minutes, Roger. So I'm going to combine 2 questions together because I think they'll work well in your answer. I'm not sure everyone knows this, but you're a great opera fan, and I would suggest probably an expert on various things and many views on it. So I was going to ask you about it, but because as time's cracking on, I'm going to combine 2 things. Opera, give us some tips, give us some thoughts on what the viewer should look for. But also, can we combine it with what are your plans for the future? Where can we expect Roger Helmer to be, and what can we expect him to be doing? Because I think the two things are going to combine here.
Well, they may well, and indeed, I would love to travel more to see opera in more places. But to give people a tip, tomorrow the Royal Opera House is starting to live screen their production of Massenet's Cinderella. La Cenerentola is the in the local language, but Cinderella. It's a big opera. It's a lot of fun. It's very accessible. It's only £3 to buy it. So here is a plug for the Royal Opera House. Get on their streaming website and buy it. And I'm really looking forward to seeing it tomorrow night. But ballet, opera and ballet. I mean, I'm terribly fond of ballet. I have supported both the English National Ballet and the Royal Ballet. And I could talk for ages about all the things I love. Perhaps one appropriate comment is I love to hear it when people are talking about music. And you often hear, in the pub, somebody says, well, I love the 80s. And somebody says, no, it's the 60s. And I love to chip in and say, well, no, Mike, I really love the 70s. But I mean the 1870s, of course. Some of the great opera music in the world was written in the late 19th century. And it's brilliant stuff. Don't like modern dance so much, although some of it's not too bad. And what am I going to do in the future? Sheila and I, my fiance and I, do a lot of traveling when we can. And we're a bit stuffed at the moment because you can't travel. And we haven't talked about COVID and injections, but you probably won't be able to go on aeroplanes or go to some countries or go on cruise ships or do all that kind of stuff if you don't have them. So I'm afraid I've decided that although I have some reservations about the vaccinations, I've decided to do that. But we're going to be doing a lot of traveling, and music will be part of it. We were in Madeira over Christmas, and in the Old English Church in Madeira, my word, they have concerts on a Sunday, and through the week, and they are absolutely brilliant. So if you're going to Madeira, look for the Old English Church and the concerts in the garden.
Excellent. Well, as you'll be used to from the European Parliament, Roger, our time on the clock is up. But we've managed
60 seconds, didn't we?
Well, exactly. We managed to get a bit longer than we used to get. So it just really remains for me to thank you for coming onto this programme. It really is a pleasure. It's great to see you and catch up with you. I knew that we'd have a lot to get through. I hope we've managed to do it justice. But I do also know that when you and I get talking, it could go on for more than an hour. It could go on for several hours. So it's been a bit of a task to keep it short. But it's been a great pleasure. And as the viewers will probably notice, our musical tastes don't coincide too much. Whenever I mention heavy metal, Roger sort of often looks at me in a nonplussed way and wonders if that's part of the orchestra. But genuinely, real pleasure to have you on, Roger. And I really wish you well for the future. I hope you can get out there and do your travelling, get to the operas and so on, and have a long, happy, fulfilled, and not too quiet retirement. I'm very sure that it won't be quiet.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bill. It's been great to be on the show.
Cheers. Thank you, everyone, and good night from us.